I am Jon Laansma. I'm the Gerald F. Hawthorne Professor of New Testament Greek and Exegesis, and I collaborated with David in this podcast. Very glad to be here.
Dr. Jon Laansma. Jon, good to see you. Welcome to the Lanier Theological Library.
It is, if you have not been to Houston, this is now a reason to come to Houston. I can say this is a phenomenal facility.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place.
It is. Yeah, it's like stepping into England.
We've got beautiful grounds and beautiful resources. You've been here in a rainy period, so it's not quite as brilliant, but
it's authentic.
It's authentic. It's like Britain, right? It needs to rain every other day, drizzle all the time. But we're glad you're here. You're here for a conference weekend and meeting lots of interesting people, I hope.
It's been great.
Having some good food.
Excellent food. Great conversation.
Well, thanks for collaborating with me on this podcast, and you're one of the key people that makes it happen. So from me to you.
In a supporting role,
Well, really key role. It really is. All right, today we're going to talk about Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, and a particular word that occurs a number of times, particularly in chapters 3 and 4, but we're going to focus on 4, 1 to 11 a little bit. So what are we looking at here? What's going on in Hebrews 3 and 4?
Well, it's a passage that, of course, we've all read, and in some ways devotionally very direct, I suppose, but also puzzling. And it's one of those texts where knowing the Greek probably adds to some of the puzzles.
Okay. So it didn't clear things up.
As you dive in. It's, the passage starts in 3:7 and following, and it's pretty straightforward for the most part, following its logic. And even into chapter 4, but I think when you hit verses 3 and 4 and he connects Psalm 95:11 with Genesis 2, then, the wheels start to fall off in terms of why did he do that? Is it justified? Again, as an exegete, you're asking that question very intensively. What does this mean about the meaning of the word? The word that's usually translated rest is katapausis, and that's kind of where I want to focus.
Okay.
And that is
and that word occurs frequently through here. Right.
Yeah, because it occurs in the Greek version of Psalm 95:11. So they will not enter into my katapausis, rest or resting place. And then he throws in another word, sabbatismas. It's in verse 9, which is a very infrequent Greek word. And the question becomes, how are those two words related to each other? Sabbatismas sounding like Sabbath, and Sabbath rest or Sabbath celebration. Are the two words being used synonymously? Are they being connected in some other way? So, a variety of questions arise in the logic of the passage and the exegesis the writer himself is doing, and in the meaning of key words. So some of it's straightforward and understandable, and we all get it. But when you get in the details, then wait, why did he do that?
Well, I mean, it seems like there are a lot of biblical writers, New Testament writers, who take keywords from the Old Testament, their Old Testament, which is, in this case is the Greek version, and they begin to sort of wax eloquent about them, and those become keywords for helping them do exegesis, but also to do and make these connections in a way. But they're not necessarily one-on-one.
And this is a key example of that kind of thing, because it becomes clear throughout the book of Hebrews that this writer is making exclusive use of the Greek version of the Old Testament, what we usually call the Septuagint, and making arguments based on the Greek text where the Greek text differs from the Hebrew text. So in this case, he connects Psalm 95:11, they will not enter into my katapausis, with Genesis 2, where God rested. It uses the verb katapau from all his works. So you can see the immediate hook word link between the two. The underlying Hebrew uses different terms, different Hebrew terms, menucha for Psalm 95:11, and the word for Sabbath in Genesis 2. So, again, different modern interpreters interpret that in different ways. Was he simply taking advantage of the Greek? to create what we would assess as a superficial link between the passages and then put it to work.
Yeah. You know, what reminds me is when a minister might be preaching and he's got a copy of the Bible, and it's the New International Version, but he's also got the English Standard Version, and he's doing, or she in some cases, is doing a comparison between the two.
Yeah.
And siding with and favoring the other.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody thinks that's a bad idea.
Right.
To take, hey, I've got a couple of versions here, and this is really clear to me, and this one's not so clear. I prefer this one, you know. And for us, we can compare dozens, you know, with something like Bible Gateway. You can compare dozens. Very easily.
But if someone went on and tried to make a major exegetical point on sort of what we'll call for the moment a chance use of the same word in those two different English translations, you know, then a thoughtful person would stop and say, well, wait, that's not legitimate. You know, let's go back and look at the Greek and the Hebrew behind those.
Yeah.
So to some extent, that's what's in play here. Now, then a whole series of other questions come on the table. Some of that has to do with derivation of the ideas as scholars try to make sense out of this. They look at Jewish apocalyptic texts like Daniel, but other Jewish texts in that vein, Fourth Ezra and elsewhere.
So what would be your best advice for puzzling through this? Is it after
Slow,
this podcast?
painful.
What is your best advice? I mean, you know, because learning Greek doesn't necessarily help you with this.
Yeah, but it puts you in a position to know what the questions really are and why they're questions. And it puts you in a position to begin to think through the answers well. You're still going to have to bear responsibility for making decisions.
Yeah.
And it's not going to answer all the questions for you.
Right.
But without access, you're not even at the table.
When we think of Sabbath rest, that's a thing that Jews did and do on the seventh day of the week. And it is a cessation of work that they typically do. Yeah. But this is pointing forward. What do you think this rest is all about?
Okay, so
I know you can't answer all of that, but what would you say the answer to that
Well,
is?
just to, cut to the chase. So one question about katapausis is it a state of rest that's in view when they will not enter into my rest? Is he talking about rest as a state, maybe a present restfulness? Or is it a local idea, a resting place? And because the writer is so soaked in the Old Testament and is citing the Old Testament, and that's where he's drawing the word from, if you look there at the use of that term, katapausis, in the Hebrew behind it, but that term, I think there's a very strong, to me, compellingly strong argument to be made that it's a local idea. Obviously, a place of rest includes a state of rest, but what he has in mind is a locale. And so I want to translate it consistently through the passage as a local idea. What you also notice when you look at the Septuagint is it's strongly associated with the temple, the tabernacle and the temple, which is, of course, a dominant concern of the book of Hebrews. So much so that one scholar who did brilliant work, but I just disagree on the detail, argued that katapausis is a technical term for the most holy place in the heavenly temple.
Ah, okay.
Well, that would work beautifully with the rest of the argument, where the language of entering in, which you have here, is entering into the most holy place, and so that would fit hand in glove. I want to leave that as a connection and not as a technical term. Okay. So I don't think he's signaling that idea precisely. Partly, not to get too far into details, partly because in verse 7 to 10, he mentions Joshua instead of the priesthood. I think if he was thinking of the temple, the entrance into the temple, he would have cited the priests as not bringing that entrance, but he goes to Joshua. So I think what he has in view is the land as a whole participating in the holiness of the tabernacle.
So in a sense, the tabernacle is infectious, it sounds like. It just...
Yeah,
by its very presence, it brings about the state. But it is localized.
It's a localized idea, and it is connected with the idea of the temple. And I think he is aware of that, even if he's not using it precisely as a technical term for the most holy place. Yeah. And I do think he's thinking, and I think this is what you were asking about, as a future entrance.
Yeah, but I think there is no. You shall not enter into my rest.
Well, in verse 3, I
looking at
admit,
the
he
wrong
uses
one,
a
yeah.
present tense verb, for
Yeah.
we enter, literally present tense, into
Yeah.
his resting place. But they often use a present tense for future time action, and especially with verbs of motion, which is aserchomai is. And I think there's contextual arguments to be made that what he's giving us here is sort of the end goal of the whole pilgrimage of salvation, which dominates the rest of the book.
Well, I'm going to encourage everybody to go read
Yes.
very carefully
Yeah.
in whatever translation
Yeah.
or whatever Greek text you got, Hebrews 3 and 4. And John, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically
Thanks for the
Speaking.
invitation. Yeah.
What a great conversation. I hope you agree. Now, there's only 168 hours until the next podcast drops, so watch for it. Subscribe to this podcast, rate us today. If you want to study biblical languages, you need to consider Wheaton College. They have the best program in the country, bar none. Go to wheaton.edu, look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. Come on, you know you want to. Thanks for those who make this podcast possible. Jon Laansma is our Wheaton-based director, Ian Rosine, and Rebecca Larson. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. Until next time, thanks for listening.